Sometimes it's just a bad day. Sometimes it's just a low moment. Sometimes it's something deeper. On today's show, we're talking about what to do when kids are feeling anxious or depressed, or sometimes just having an off day. But most importantly, we're talking about what you can do about it. What's going on, family? This is the Opportunity Gap, and I'm your host, Julian. Joining us for this really important conversation is Dr. Karen Wilson. She's a clinical neuropsychologist and an understood expert. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Karen Wilson to the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with you, Julian.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so let's get right into it. Today, again, we're talking about anxiety and depression. So can you speak to what the correlation is between learning and thinking differences and the likelihood of feeling anxiety and or depression?
Yes, there definitely is a link. And thank you so much for bringing this topic to the conversation, because I think it's something that's really important, particularly when you have young people whose brains are wired differently. And oftentimes the focus is on helping them get through school, helping them get through academics. Can they focus in the classroom? Can we teach them how to do math? And oftentimes when kids struggle over an extended period of time, it can impact their self-concept, impacts the way they feel about themselves, the way they believe others perceive them, and those negative feelings and the negative narratives that they create about themselves and who they are and the kind of student they are and what they're capable of can contribute to, again, a low self-concept, can contribute to feelings of anxiety and worry, and can go as far as feeling hopeless and contribute to those feelings of depression as a result.
So it sounds like, if I'm a child and I might be struggling academically, then naturally I might start to compound some of those feelings, and that can transfer into deeper depression and or that feeling of anxiety or anxiousness in school.
That's correct.
I mean, I'm sure it's a really tough spot to be in, right? Where you have a kid who is struggling and emotionally they're having a hard time, especially when some signs might be easy to miss or mistaken for something else. What are some signs that a child might be experiencing the anxiety or the depression that you speak of? Like what are some concrete things that we can look for?
What's interesting, Julian, is there's so much overlap because, kids who get frustrated with their schoolwork might have a temper tantrum, they might cry, they might avoid the schoolwork, and you just might think this is some resistance to the schoolwork and to the resistance to doing things that are hard for them, which can absolutely be true and it's expected. So when we think about kids with learning and thinking differences, when they develop depression and anxiety, it's usually you're noticing changes that go beyond their usual challenges, right? A child with ADHD who might normally struggle with focus and staying engaged and staying on task. When depression enters the picture, you might see more sadness, more tearfulness. You might see them pulling away from activities, pulling away from friends, things that they used to enjoy. All of a sudden, they don't want to go to soccer practice. They don't want to have a play date. And so those are some things that you might see in kids with depression. With anxiety, you might see more avoidance of things that can be anxiety provoking for them. So all of a sudden, they might not want to go to school, right? They might resist going to school because that's a place that is anxiety provoking for them. They might no longer want to go to birthday parties. They might not want to, do other things that they would normally do. They might start complaining of stomach aches and headaches before school, might call from the principal's office because they're not feeling well and ask to be picked up. The emotional meltdowns might become more intense, and particularly when facing challenging tasks. And when kids are anxious, one of the things that they want to do is to avoid things that cause them anxiety. So all of a sudden they don't want to do those things that they would normally push through, even with support. So it goes beyond just the typical frustration you might see in kids with learning and thinking challenges. And it goes beyond also just impacting those specific areas so they might be struggling. So a kid, for example, with dyslexia might have a lot of emotional meltdowns around doing things that require reading. But
Right.
when it persists beyond just the learning difference into mental health, into depression, anxiety, you'll see it be a little more pervasive and impacting multiple areas of a child's life. And you'll also see it occurring across different settings. So it's happening at school, it's happening at home, it might be happening, when they go to grandma's house, things like that.
Interesting. So it's something that impacts the child globally as opposed to the specific area of concern that the disability presents itself. That's a really interesting distinction. And that's something that I know a lot of our listeners, they're always wondering, like the
Mm-hmm.
difference between a day where you just might be having a rough day, right? We all know that a
Right.
lot of our kids, they might just have a rough day, or they might have a series of days that are just, it's a tough stretch, or they might, they're just going through it. How do parents know, all
Mm.
right, it's not just them going through it. It's not just, maybe it's wintertime and they're just struggling, or something happened, even for our teenagers, maybe a relationship changed and they're struggling. How do they know that it's something deeper than that? What's the differentiation? Like, is there a time component? Is there a deeper presentation of these feelings? Like, what is it that parents should know to know, like, this is something more serious?
Yes. And I think that is so important to ask because, all children will feel sad sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Children and teens will find something to be sad about, have
And
an
parents
experience,
and
yes, and
adults,
parents
all of us,
and
right?
caregivers, yes, because things happen. A kid doesn't want, another child may not want to sit with them at lunch. They have a disagreement with their best friend.
Mm-hmm.
They might have not get the grade that they wanted on a test, even though they worked really hard. So there are a lot of things that can contribute to feeling down or having a low mood, feeling sad. Everybody is going to feel sad sometimes. That's completely normal. I think it's important to say that. The
Right.
difference between like a temporary sadness that might be related to an event, something that happened, and for example, a clinical depression, something that you would definitely want to get some support around, really comes down to three things. It's how long it lasts, how intense it is, and also how much it impacts a child and adolescent's daily life. So normal sadness might resolve within that same day. It might resolve within a couple days, and it doesn't typically impact the child's daily functioning. So they're going to go to school the next day, they're going to get a good night's sleep, they're going to finish their homework, they're going to snuggle with their parents, everything else will be okay. But with clinical depression, for example, it typically persists for at least 2 weeks. So that's again how long it lasts.
Mm-hmm.
And it can make it difficult for a child to engage in other activities. So it might be hard for them to get out of bed in the morning. It might disrupt their sleep. It might be difficult to get them to go to school. They might not, again, want to do the things that they would normally do. So then again, that's impacting their daily functioning. And then the intensity is the third piece, right? There's a lot of sadness, a lot of tearfulness, a lot of emotional outbursts. Again, these are things that are persisting for at least 2 weeks. So it's gone on for a long period of time. And I
Got
think
it.
another thing to keep in mind is that with young children, often depression kind of presents itself like irritability more so than sadness. So that's kind of a distinction between adult depression and depression that you would see in children. It presents as more like irritability,
Got
right?
it.
And also it can disrupt sleep patterns. All of a sudden kids want to sleep with their parents when this is a change, again,
Mm-hmm.
a change from how they were previously. They might not sleep for as long a period of time. They may have disrupted sleep. They may have a hard time falling asleep, staying asleep. You might see changes in appetite. All of a sudden, they don't want to eat as much, or they're eating too much. They're overeating. And again, one of the things I said was that they start to lose interest in things that they used to really enjoy.
Mm,
Activities they used to look forward to, all of a sudden, they've lost that interest in doing those things.
got it. Let's talk a little bit about how people choose to handle depression and
Mm-hmm.
anxiety. In my day job, I'm an assistant principal at a high school in
Mm-hmm.
Philadelphia, right? And I've worked in high needs urban schools for my entire career, and we have a large amount of kids who have IEPs for a variety of learning and thinking differences, and I find that a lot of our students with that designation also sometimes exhibit signs of depression or
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, as you say, right? Like it's more prevalent with kids who have learning and thinking differences, right? So I've
Right.
experienced that in my own career.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were prepping for this show, I have conversations with kids all the time, and I was having this conversation with one of my students a couple weeks ago about how they choose to manage their feelings of anxiety around school. Right, this young man, he has ADHD, and he's known he's had ADHD his entire life, and he used to take medicine. He took a variety of different stimulants when he was in grammar school, and he stopped taking them when he came to high school.
Mm-hmm.
And he's chosen to try to manage the like heavy feelings. He says he calls them heavy feelings when he
Mm-hmm.
comes into school, and he says, I have these heavy feelings, Mrs. Svedra, and so instead of taking the meds the doctor was giving me, I'm choosing to smoke. And I'm like, what you mean smoke? He's like, I smoke weed before school to try to help calm me down so I can get my mind calm so I can come into school.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really helped me. And so I say all that because I'm wondering, from your clinical perspective and your background, one, are you seeing the same thing with kids choosing to self medicate?
Um,
And then two, what does self medicating mean in the context of a teenager or a child doing this to try to manage these emotions and symptoms that they're experiencing? So, one, are
yeah.
you seeing this? Two, what does it mean in the context of managing it themselves?
Right. And I think it's, in terms of seeing it, I think it's not unusual or atypical for teens in general, regardless of whether or not they have learning and thinking differences, to, experiment, to use alcohol, to use marijuana, to cope with emotions in general, and to manage life, to fit in socially, and also they might like the way it makes them feel. And a lot of teens will self-medicate who don't have learning differences because they know that the substances they're using makes them feel less anxious, and so
Right.
they feel more comfortable in situations, and it has nothing to do with the learning difference.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to teens using substances like marijuana, there is cause for concern for a couple of reasons. One, their brains are still developing, so they're not, a full-fledged adult with a fully developed frontal lobe system. Those areas of the brain are still developing, and so when you're taking a substance into your system, you can actually change the way your brain is developing.
Got it.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that teenagers with learning differences are up to 40% more likely to develop substance use problems relative to their peers who also might experiment as well. So they're at
Wow.
greater
Can
risk
you
for
repeat that
dependent. Yes.
statistic again? Because that's really important,
Yeah.
listeners, to hear.
Yes, I think so. What I was saying is that teenagers with learning differences are up to 40% more likely to develop substance use problems compared to their peers, which means that when they're attempting and experimenting with substances, they're more likely to have difficulties related to the use than their peers who experiment with substances who do not have learning differences.
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting.
And the higher risk for using substances comes from, a mix of social challenges. So you've got students with learning and thinking differences who want to fit in socially. And
Right.
so those social challenges put them at greater risk for trying something that makes them feel more comfortable in social situations. School frustrations play a role. So they're trying to find something that will alleviate some of that school frustration. And again, it's their own attempts to manage emotional distress, discomfort. It can be depression, it can be anxiety. And, while some teens will say that they temporarily experience some relief from anxiety, the long-term studies show that it can have a negative impact on their cognitive development in a way that you wouldn't see right away, but you see later on. And part of that is because THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, affects the brain systems that are responsible for planning, for organization, for emotional regulation and control. And these are areas where students with learning differences are already struggling. So what happens is you can actually exacerbate difficulties with executive functioning, even though students might be saying it makes them feel more calm.
Got it. So speaking of that, let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about support, like ongoing support for managing depression and or anxiety over the long term. versus an urgent, like almost crisis situation, right? Because there's distinctions between what it looks like over the long term versus something that has to happen
Right.
immediately. So, Dr. Karen, in your experience, what are some effective strategies or best practices parents can use to help their kids manage depression or anxiety over time? Right? Because you said one of the distinctions is these symptoms are happening over time, like at least 2 weeks or more.
Right.
It's not something that's just going to go away overnight. What are some strategies that you would recommend for parents or guardians to help their children manage this over the long term?
Yeah, I think talking with your child is so important because then you get a sense of, again, the intensity, how long this has been going on, and how much it's impacting their daily lives. So that lets you know how urgent it is. If they have thoughts of self-harm, then obviously it's much more urgent. It may even require hospitalization, but that
Yeah,
is
we're going to
again
get to that in a second because
that's
I'm
going to be a
definitely going to ask about that.
more urgent situation.
Got
But
it.
in terms of building kind of long-term resilience, right, which is what you want. So when those feelings of sadness, of frustration, of self-deprecation, of hopelessness, worry come, that our teens will have resources and tools that they can use to get through some of those hard times. And some of that in terms of what parents can do is to helping young people develop a growth mindset, help them to know that even though things are hard now, they don't have to be hard all the time. They don't have to stay hard.
So,
And that,
would you recommend
yeah,
like saying that exact
yeah,
line? Like, say again, your
absolutely.
child comes home and they go right into their room, say, I don't want to
Hmm.
talk, or
Hmm.
I don't feel like talking to you right now. And I know a lot of people listening, they
Hmm.
will say, like, my teenager or even my 8 year old, they come home and they don't want to talk to me. They don't
Yeah.
want to talk about anything. And you're recommending, say, no, you have to have a growth mindset.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
I wouldn't say it like that. I definitely wouldn't use those words.
got
And
it.
so there's two things. One, if a child needs space, then you want to honor that space, right? Obviously, you
So,
want to make
got it.
sure that
So,
they're safe,
okay.
but sometimes they just need to be by themselves to blow off steam, to think about what happened, and then they'll reemerge, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
you have the conversation. And the conversation doesn't have to be, we need to talk, let's sit down. It can be, let's go for a walk, let's go for a drive, let's go get some ice cream, let's go grab some dinner. And you have the conversation in, again, the safe space where they can, open up about what's happening, maybe not in the moment where they're feeling overwhelmed or they're slamming doors, when they've had time to kind of think about it. And that's really the best time to engage in a conversation.
Got it. So over the long term, really creating a space or a practice or even a predictable
Mm-hmm.
flow of conversation with your child, so that over time they know that you're not going to give up on them. Like
Yes.
essentially, what you're saying is the child needs to know that you're there, that they have somebody that can be safe with them.
Mm-hmm.
What about in a crisis situation? And I ask that because again, I've experienced crisis situations more
Okay.
than I care to say because there's just been so many that have happened. It can be really overwhelming for everybody involved, right? Not only the parents,
Right.
but the friends, the teachers, or the school staff if it's happening at school, wherever it happens at home. It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering from your perspective, Dr. Karen, are there any red flag or emergency signs parents or caregivers can look out for or be alerted to so that they know, all right, this is crisis. This is a
Yeah.
serious situation.
Yeah. I think anytime a child is engaging in self-harm, or they're talking about self-harm or hurting themselves or not wanting to be alive anymore, I think those are significant red flags. And those are situations where you want to get a professional involved. You might need to take a child to an emergency room. You might need to call 911 and get an ambulance if you're afraid for their safety. If they said they're going to do something and they've told you what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, and they've locked themselves in the bathroom, then obviously that's an urgent situation. So I think those are things that you want to be mindful of and look out for. It
Right.
can be very scary for parents, for caregivers, because you don't know what to do in those moments. But again, being there, just being physically present and being a person who is going to listen to what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And also at the same time, making sure that you're reaching out for the support you need, whether that is a crisis hotline, whether that is 911, whatever that might be, just to ensure the safety of the child or adolescent in your
Got
care.
it.
I think it's also important to know that not every child who says, I wish I was never born, is having suicide ideation, right? And that's where the listening comes in, because it
Yes.
might be like, I wish I was never born. Well, what does that mean? What would that look like, right? You want to get more information, because the child might say, oh, I'd never hurt myself. I've had kids say, sometimes I wish I were never born, but I would never hurt myself. I would never do anything like that. And so it's getting more information so you can determine whether or not your child is at risk for harming themselves.
Got it. So the last question I have, or last topic of conversation I wanted to bring up, as you know, you are a featured guest on the Opportunity Gap, and the focus of our show is to bring to light the needs and support for children and families of color. Knowing that in our community, mental health and depression, anxiety, historically, there's been a stigma around that, or in some cases, people don't even believe it's a thing. They don't think it's real. I'm wondering, what's your experience with that side of it, and what would you say to our community specifically for Black and Brown families out there that might have questions about mental health or might have questions about depression or anxiety?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is to seek out professionals who you have a comfort with.
Mm-hmm.
Seek out people, because oftentimes in our community, you feel more comfortable with people who look like you,
Right.
right? Because there's some kind of understanding that you may have had similar experiences, that you may see things in similar ways, and there's a comfort there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may even mean, podcasts like this one, are really helpful and provide a lot of information. There's a lot of Black female therapists who have podcast episodes about different topics. There's, groups for Black women with autism, right? Black autistic women. And so seek out the community who's providing support. That can be really helpful. And again, we're talking about how it can be hard to get in to see a therapist, particularly one that looks like you, but there are a lot of people who provide either YouTube channels about mental health. You want to make sure that these people have the credentials to be saying what they're saying, and they're not
Yes,
just someone with
yes.
an opinion.
Get the receipts
Yes,
and
get the
then look
receipts,
up
make
their
sure.
degrees. Exactly.
Absolutely. There are a lot of really great clinicians of color doing really great work and getting a lot of great information out into the world. And you just have to do your research to find them. And you can get a lot of really great information and tips on how to support yourself as a caregiver and how to support your child who might be struggling with learning difference or social emotional challenges. And so that's where I would kind of say to go, because I think we're getting better as a community about recognizing mental health. I think there's less stigma now than there was probably even 5-10 years ago.
Right.
And we can talk about the downside of social media, but the upside is that more people are being open about mental health challenges. More people are saying, this helped me, or this clinician helped me, or I suffer from depression, or my child has been experiencing anxiety. And I think when you see that you're not the only one who is experiencing this, then that can be very comforting, and it provides, some hope for people who might be struggling in silence.
I could talk to you all day long, and this lived up and exceeded my expectations. Your expertise is relevant and so prevalent in everything that you speak of. I love that you dropped all these different concrete strategies for our listeners. And I would highly, highly recommend anybody listening to just check out her work. You can Google her. You can find everything that she's done. You've done some really amazing work for the culture and for our children. So I just wanted to salute you and appreciate you for everything that you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing and for having this conversation with me today. So I appreciate it.
All right, OG family, that wraps today's episode. Until next time, thank you so much. Understood.org is a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering people with learning and thinking differences, like ADHD and dyslexia. If you want to help us continue this work, donate at understood.org/give. The Opportunity Gap is produced by Tara Drinks and Cody Nelson. Video is produced by Calvin Kniep and edited by Nico Rothenberg. Our theme music was written by Justin D. Wright, who also mixes the show. Samaya Adams is our supervising producer. Brianna Berry is our production director. Neil Drumming is our editorial director. From Understood.org, our executive directors are Laura Key, Scott Cochere, Seth Melnick, and Jordan Davidson. Thanks again for listening.